A German mechanic, his hands permanently stained black with grease, stares at the captured American vehicle. It's an absurdity, a metal box on wheels, barely 11 feet long, flimsy as a ration tin, with a comically upright windshield that looks like it would shatter from a harsh glance. Wehrmacht officers, men who understood the physics of war through the lens of Krupp steel and the engineered bulk of their Kubelwagens, saw these first captured jeeps and shared a cynical laugh. It was a toy, a staff car for amateurs who didn't understand the brutal poetry of a blitzkrieg. But then, the laughter died in their throats. It was replaced by a bewildered silence, then by grudging respect, and finally, by a deep, strategic dread, because the numbers, the sheer impossible numbers, began to flood in. By the time the Allies tore open Fortress Europe on the shores of Normandy, there weren't thousands of these toys. There were over 600,000 of them, rolling, crawling, and swimming across the continent. This is the story of how a vehicle that weighed just over 1 ton, a machine born from desperation and designed in 2 days, became a strategic weapon that fundamentally altered the mathematics of a world war. In the humid summer of 1940, the United States Army was a ghost of its former self. While Hitler's Wehrmacht, a mechanized juggernaut, sliced through France in a matter of weeks, the American military was a third-rate power. It ranked 17th in the world, its forces smaller than those of Portugal or Romania. The recently concluded Louisiana maneuvers, a massive war game involving 400,000 troops, had been a logistical nightmare, revealing a terrifying truth. A significant portion of American artillery was still being pulled into position by horses and mules. The need for radical mechanization wasn't just urgent, it was a matter of national survival. On June 27, 1940, the Army's Ordnance Technical Committee, under the shadow of a looming global conflict, formalized a request and sent it to 135 American automakers. The document was less a request for a vehicle and more a demand for a miracle. The specifications were a study in brutal, almost contradictory ambition. They needed a quarter-ton, four-wheel drive reconnaissance vehicle. Its wheelbase could be no more than a compact 80 inches, its track no more than 47 inches, its height a mere 40 inches. It had to carry a 600-pound payload, which included a crew of 3 and a Pintle-mounted 30-caliber machine gun. But the final specification was the ghost in the machine, the number that haunted engineers and made corporate executives shake their heads. Its empty weight could not exceed 1,300 pounds. To the titans of the American auto industry, this was pure fantasy. A vehicle built to survive the rigors of a battlefield at that weight would need to be made of paper. The response from Detroit was a deafening, resounding silence. General Motors, with its colossal industrial might, deemed it impossible. Chrysler concurred. Ford, a company built on production miracles, hesitated, unwilling to divert its massive resources for a paltry initial government order of just 70 vehicles. The entire industrial engine of the United States seemed paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the demand. Only one company, a tiny, sputtering automaker from Butler, Pennsylvania, raised a trembling hand: the American Bantam Car Company. Bantam was on the verge of bankruptcy, a minnow swimming in a tank of sharks. In 1939, they had produced fewer than 1,300 cars. They had nothing to lose. In a desperate gamble, they reached out to Karl Probst, a freelance Detroit engineer with a reputation for genius. Probst initially turned the job down flat, sharing the industry's consensus that the project was a fool's errand. But the Army, persistent and persuasive, appealed directly to his patriotism. On July 17, 1940, Probst walked into Bantam's offices and agreed to work, unpaid, on the impossible machine. What followed was one of the most remarkable sprints in engineering history. In just 2 days, a whirlwind 48 hours of frantic calculation and drawing, he had laid out the complete blueprints for the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, or BRC. He and the Bantam team made a crucial, strategic decision. They would ignore the 1,300-pound weight limit. They knew it was a physical impossibility if the vehicle was to have any semblance of durability. They aimed for a more realistic target, betting that a working, tangible prototype would be more persuasive to the Army than a fanatical adherence to an impossible number. They cobbled together a vehicle from a hodgepodge of off-the-shelf parts, a modified 45-horsepower engine from the Continental Car Company, axles from the Willys Americar, and a transfer case from Spicer. On September 21, 1940, with just 30 minutes to spare before the 49-day deadline expired, the hand-built prototype, affectionately dubbed the Blitz Buggy, roared into the Army's evaluation center at Camp Holabird, Maryland. It tipped the scales at 2,030 pounds, but it was there, and it worked. The Army evaluators at Camp Holabird were stunned. The little Bantam prototype was a revelation. It was agile, it was tough, and it scrambled up hills and through mud pits with a tenacity that belied its small size. It exceeded every performance expectation the Army had laid out, failing in only one category, the phantom weight limit of 1,300 pounds. But the Army, facing the terrifying prospect of a global war, was an institution of ruthless pragmatists. They knew Bantam, with its tiny factory and skeletal finances, was incapable of producing the vehicle in the biblical quantities that would be required. So they made a decision that was as strategically brilliant as it was ethically questionable. They took possession of Karl Probst's blueprints, declared the design to be government property, and openly encouraged Bantam's much larger, more established competitors, Willys Overland and Ford, to use them as a reference. It was a brutal act of industrial appropriation. Bantam, the tiny company that had answered the nation's call when no one else would, was about to be devoured by the giants it had awoken. Willys Overland, a company based in Toledo, Ohio, held a powerful ace up its sleeve. Its engine, their chief engineer, a man named Delmar Barney Roos, had been perfecting a powerful and astonishingly durable four-cylinder engine. The L-134, which would become famously known as the Go Devil, was a marvel. It produced 60 horsepower and a robust 105 pound-feet of torque from its 134 cubic inches. This was a quantum leap in power over the Bantam prototype's 45 horsepower Continental engine. On November 11, 1940, Willys delivered its prototype, the Quad, to Camp Holabird. It was heavy, and its initial design was clumsy, but the moment the evaluators heard the confident roar of the Go Devil engine, they knew it was a game-changer. Just 2 days later, Ford Motor Company entered the fray. Their Pygmy prototype arrived, showcasing the company's legendary manufacturing savvy. The Pygmy featured a simpler, stamped steel flat grille with the headlights integrated behind the bars for protection, a clever, easily produced design feature that would ultimately be adopted for the final standardized model. Ford's true strength, however, was not design innovation, but its unparalleled mastery of mass production. The Army knew that if they needed 500,000 vehicles built yesterday, only the ghost of Henry Ford could deliver that kind of miracle. The three vehicles, the improved Bantam BRC-40, the Willys MA, and the Ford GP, were now pitted against each other in a torturous series of trials. The Army, hedging its bets, placed an order for 1,500 units from each company for extensive field testing. The reports that came back from Army units across the country were unanimous. All three vehicles were good, but the Willys MA, with its mighty Go Devil heart, was exceptional. The decision was made. The Army would create a single, standardized design that would incorporate the best features of all three competitors. This process of industrial Darwinism, though it effectively crushed Bantam's hopes, was essential to creating a true weapon of war. The final standardized model was designated the Willys MB for Model B. It would be based on the superior Willys MA, but it would incorporate the Ford GP's practical front-end design, along with dozens of other small refinements from all three prototypes. The little car that Bantam had birthed now had two powerful adoptive parents. It was a vehicle born not on a single drawing board, but forged in the fires of industrial competition and government mandate. It was now ready for the assembly line, and the scale of what was to come would defy all belief. Before it could conquer the battlefields of the world, the Jeep had to conquer the factory floor. the U.S. government awarded the first major contract for 16,000 vehicles to Willys Overland on July 23, 1941. It was a massive order, but within months, as the world plunged deeper into war, it became terrifyingly clear that it was a mere drop in the ocean. The demand was astronomical, far exceeding what the Willys factory in Toledo could possibly produce. In a move that showcased the government's absolute authority over wartime industry, the Army turned to Ford. Ford was designated as a second source producer. They were handed the complete Willys blueprints and ordered to begin manufacturing an identical vehicle, which would be designated the Ford GPW. G for government, P for its 80-inch wheelbase, and W for the licensed Willys design. This decision was a logistical masterstroke that would have profound consequences. Every single part, from the engine block to the smallest screw, on a Willys MB had to be 100% interchangeable with its counterpart on a Ford GPW. A fender made in Toledo had to fit a chassis made in Dearborn perfectly. A Willys engine had to bolt seamlessly into a Ford-built frame. This fanatical devotion to standardization was unprecedented in the auto industry and became a cornerstone of the Allied war effort. It meant that a single, unified supply chain of spare parts could service the entire Jeep fleet, regardless of where the vehicle was assembled. A mechanic in the middle of the North African desert could take a transmission from a wrecked Ford and put it into a damaged Willys, getting a vital vehicle back into the fight in hours. Soldiers on the front lines didn't know or care if they were driving an MB or a GPW. They just called it a Jeep, a name whose origins are still debated, but which became a universal term for the tough little car. The production numbers that followed were a testament to the raw power of the American arsenal of democracy. At their peak, the Willys and Ford plants were churning out a new Jeep every 90 seconds. The cost to the government was approximately $739 per unit, a remarkably low price for such a capable machine. This industrial velocity was a weapon in its own right. While German industry, under constant Allied bombing and plagued by overly complex designs, struggled to produce its vehicles, American factories operated 24 hours a day, an unstoppable torrent of olive-drab steel. The little car that German generals would soon laugh at was more than just a vehicle. It was the physical manifestation of America's awakened industrial might. It was built by a workforce transformed by war, with millions of women, the iconic Rosie the Riveters, taking their places on the assembly lines. They welded frames, installed the Go Devil engines, and painted the olive-drab finish, becoming an essential part of the war machine. Each completed Jeep wasn't just 2,153 pounds of metal, it was a unit of mobility and power, a promise delivered, ready to be shipped to any corner of the globe. The journey from the factory to the front was a global logistical ballet of incredible complexity. To save precious cargo space on ships, Jeeps were often partially disassembled and packed flat into large wooden crates. They arrived on the docks of England, the shores of North Africa, and the frozen ports of the Soviet Union as Jeeps in a box. Soldiers, often with minimal training, would uncrate and assemble them in makeshift outdoor workshops, a process that could take as little as 4 hours. This method, known as completely knocked down, or CKD, ensured the vehicles arrived at the front lines in pristine condition, ready for immediate, brutal deployment. The first major theater where the Jeep's strategic value became brutally, undeniably clear was the harsh, unforgiving landscape of North Africa. During Operation Torch in late 1942, American forces landed with thousands of these new vehicles. The German Afrika Korps, seasoned veterans and self-proclaimed masters of desert warfare, initially dismissed them. Their own Volkswagen-designed Kubelwagen was a competent vehicle, but it was only two-wheel drive, and its 25-horsepower air-cooled engine, while reliable, lacked the sheer grunt of the Jeep's 60-horsepower Go Devil. It was an unequal contest from the start. The shock came quickly and decisively. U.S. reconnaissance patrols, mounted in Jeeps often armed with heavy M250 caliber machine guns, could skim across the rocky terrain and hard-packed sand with an agility that the Germans simply could not match. They could scout enemy positions, conduct lightning-fast raids on supply lines, and then vanish back into the desert heat haze before the slower, heavier German ZKHFs. 222 armored cars could effectively respond. This wasn't a conventional fight. It was an asymmetric one, pitting raw, unadulterated mobility against heavier, more traditional assets. The little car was rewriting the rules of desert warfare. In the rugged mountains of Tunisia, particularly during the brutal fighting at Kasserine Pass in early 1943, the Jeep's role evolved from reconnaissance to indispensable combat support. It became the ultimate off-road utility vehicle. When German forces held the high ground, conventional trucks were restricted to the vulnerable, easily targeted valley roads. Jeeps, however, could claw their way up rugged tracks and ancient goat paths, towing 37mm anti-tank guns and hauling critical ammunition to positions that would have otherwise been cut off and annihilated. It was a mule, a tractor, and a gun platform, all wrapped in one compact, 2,000-pound package. The vehicle's almost primitive simplicity was another profound advantage in the desert environment. The fine, abrasive sand that could cripple the more complex, finely engineered German machinery was less of a threat to the rugged, no-frills design of the Jeep. Field repairs were astonishingly simple and fast. As one U.S. Army maintenance officer noted in a 1943 report, "You can fix just about anything on a Jeep with a wrench, a hammer, and some swear words. With the German stuff, you need a bloody engineer and a clean room." This battlefield serviceability kept a higher percentage of Jeeps in the fight, a critical factor in a brutal war of attrition. The joke that had been circulating in the Wehrmacht officers' messes was now on them. The little car was a predator. The British, recognizing its potential, quickly adopted it for their elite special forces. The Long Range Desert Group, LRDG, and the Special Air Service, SAS, turned the Jeep into a desert warship. They stripped them of all non-essential parts, windshields, and sometimes even the grille, to save weight. They loaded them with a staggering amount of extra fuel cans, water, and an arsenal of forward-facing and rear-mounted Vickers K machine guns. These modified Jeeps became ghosts of the desert, capable of traveling hundreds of miles behind Axis lines to attack enemy airfields and convoys, creating chaos and forcing the Germans to divert significant resources to hunt them down. The laughter had stopped. The little American car had become a weapon of strategic importance. If North Africa was the Jeep's proving ground, then Europe was its coronation. From the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 through the final, bloody push into the heart of Germany, the Jeep was the ubiquitous, tireless workhorse of the Allied armies. Its small size, once a point of ridicule, became a massive tactical advantage in the narrow, winding roads of ancient Italian mountain villages and the constricted, rubble-choked streets of liberated French towns. Where larger German trucks and armored cars created crippling traffic jams, a column of Jeeps could flow like water, maintaining the momentum of the advance. During the Normandy campaign, which began on the historic morning of June 6, 1944, the scale of the Jeep deployment was simply immense. Every single infantry regiment in the U.S. Army had an authorized strength of 144 Jeeps. They served as command cars for generals like Patton and Bradley, ferrying them across the chaotic beachheads to direct the battle. They acted as battlefield taxis, rushing squads of riflemen to plug a gap in the line or exploit a sudden breakthrough. They laid thousands of miles of communication wire, with a soldier in the passenger seat spooling it out from a large reel as the Jeep drove along, connecting the front line to the command posts. Most poignantly, they were transformed into field ambulances. With locally fabricated steel racks, a single Jeep could carry 3 wounded soldiers on litters, evacuating them from the very edge of the battlefield, from terrain no standard ambulance could ever hope to reach. And here, in this dual-use capability, we find a complex ethical gray area, a subject of continued debate among military historians. The same vehicle, marked with a red cross and used to save lives under the protection of the Geneva Convention, could, in a matter of minutes, have its litters removed and a heavy machine gun mounted in its place. For the Allies, this was the ultimate expression of battlefield utility and pragmatism. For the Germans, it blurred the sacred line between non-combatant and combatant, making every single olive-drab vehicle a potential, unpredictable threat. This duality, savior and killer housed in the same steel chassis, is central to the Jeep's complicated legacy. The logistical support role of the Jeep cannot be overstated. After the Normandy breakout during Operation Cobra, the Allied supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. The famous Red Ball Express, a massive, non-stop trucking operation, handled the bulk of the supplies, but it was the humble Jeep that performed the critical last-mile delivery. They hauled small M100 trailers packed with gasoline, ammunition, and rations directly to the fighting units, often driving through muddy fields and dense forests, impassable to the big 2.5-ton GMC trucks. Without the Jeep's ability to keep the spearheads supplied, the lightning advance across France in the summer of 1944 would have inevitably stalled. It was in the brutal, freezing winter of 1944, during the desperate fighting of the Battle of the Bulge, that the Jeep's sheer tenacity was truly tested. In the snow-clogged forests of the Ardennes, it was one of the few wheeled vehicles that could still operate with any degree of effectiveness. They were fitted with snow chains and used as impromptu snowplows to clear paths for other vehicles. They served as mobile anti-tank platforms, with two-man bazooka teams using shoot and scoot tactics against formidable German Panther and Tiger tanks. For the besieged 101st Airborne Division surrounded at Bastogne, Jeeps were a lifeline, ferrying dwindling supplies and evacuating casualties in the sub-zero temperatures. Once again, the small, seemingly insignificant vehicle was delivering an outsized strategic impact at the most critical moments of the war. While the Jeep's exploits in Western Europe are the stuff of legend, its impact on the apocalyptic struggle of the Eastern Front was just as profound, if not more so. Through the massive Lend-Lease program, the United States shipped over 51,000 Jeeps, along with hundreds of thousands of Studebaker trucks, to the Soviet Union. The Red Army, which in 1941 still relied heavily on horses for transport, was utterly transformed by this sudden, massive influx of American mobility. The Soviets, who often referred to all such vehicles simply and affectionately as Willys, revered the Jeep for its incredible toughness and seemingly magical off-road capability. The vast, often roadless expanses of Russia and Ukraine were the ideal territory for the Jeep. It became the preferred vehicle for Soviet reconnaissance units, forward artillery observers, and company commanders. Its ability to navigate the thick, clinging mud of the Rasputitsa, the notorious spring and autumn mud seasons that regularly bogged down entire armies, both German and Soviet, gave Red Army commanders a crucial mobility advantage. It was an instrumental tool in the successful execution of the Soviet deep battle doctrine, which relied on rapid, mechanized advances to encircle and annihilate vast German armies. The Jeep's influence was not limited to reconnaissance and command roles. Soviet commanders, masters of battlefield improvisation, used them as light artillery tractors, towing 76mm anti-tank guns and heavy mortars with a speed that astonished their German adversaries. They were even used on hastily prepared airfields to tow fighter aircraft. Marshal of the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov, the architect of the victory at Stalingrad and the man who accepted Germany's surrender in Berlin, was frequently photographed in a Willys, a testament to its high status within the Red Army's command structure. The steady supply of American Jeeps and trucks allowed the Soviets to maintain a relentless operational tempo that the German war machine, starved of fuel and vehicles, simply could no longer match. The Pacific Theater presented a different, but no less demanding, set of challenges. In the dense, suffocating jungles of Burma, New Guinea, and the Philippines, the Jeep was often the only vehicle capable of navigating the narrow, muddy, vine-choked tracks. It served with distinction, with legendary units like Merrill's Marauders, who used them for long-range penetration missions deep behind Japanese lines. Its ability to ford shallow rivers and streams, thanks to its high-mounted air intake and distributor, made it invaluable in a region dominated by monsoons and tropical terrain. A specialized amphibious version, the Ford GPA, nicknamed the Seep for Sea Jeep, was developed specifically for this environment and for European river crossings. While it had mixed success as a boat, it was slow in the water, and its low freeboard made it vulnerable to swamping. It was a testament to the platform's incredible versatility. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the tropical islands of the Pacific, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Europe, the Jeep proved to be a universal, indispensable tool of war. The little car from Butler, Pennsylvania, had become a global phenomenon, a symbol of Allied power in every corner of the world. When the guns finally fell silent in May and August of 1945, over 647,000 Jeeps had been built by Willys and Ford. Their job as weapons of war was over, but their story was far from finished. The logistical challenge of bringing hundreds of thousands of them back to the United States was prohibitive. As a result, thousands were left behind in liberated countries, where they were sold as military surplus and became the foundation for post-war transportation and recovery. In the Philippines, surplus Jeeps were famously and flamboyantly modified. Their chassis were lengthened, they were fitted with benches to hold as many as 20 passengers, and they were decorated with vibrant colors, chrome ornaments, and religious iconography. They became the iconic jeepneys, the backbone of the nation's public transit system, a rolling, vibrant symbol of post-war Filipino ingenuity and culture. In the fields of France and Italy, farmers welded plows to the back of them, using the tireless Go Devil engine to till land that had, only months before, been battlefields. Willys Overland, the primary manufacturer, shrewdly recognized the vehicle's immense potential for civilian life. In 1945, they launched the CJ-2A, the first civilian Jeep. It was a slightly refined version of its military parent, featuring a tailgate, a side-mounted spare tire, and larger headlights. It was marketed not as a passenger car, but as a versatile tool for farmers and industrial workers, advertised with the slogan, "The All-American Farm Horse." This single act marked the birth of the commercial sport, utility, and off-road vehicle, a market segment that had never existed before the war. The Jeep's core DNA, its rugged simplicity and go-anywhere capability, would define this new category of automobile for the next 80 years. The Jeep's influence on global automotive design is almost impossible to overstate. In the United Kingdom, the first Land Rover, produced in 1948, was famously designed using a surplus Jeep chassis and axles as its foundation. In Japan, Toyota's legendary Land Cruiser began life as the Toyota Jeep BJ in 1951, a direct response to the U.S. Army's need for a similar vehicle during the Korean War. Almost every 4x4 vehicle in the world today, from the Suzuki Jimny to the Mercedes G-Wagon, owes a direct design debt to the original Willys MB. The cultural impact was just as lasting and profound. The Jeep became a global symbol of American ingenuity, resilience, and a rugged, can-do attitude. It was the vehicle of heroes in countless war films and television shows, a symbol of freedom, adventure, and the ability to overcome any obstacle. The famous war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who was beloved by the common GI, perhaps captured it best. It did everything. It went everywhere, was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. His words perfectly encapsulated the deep, personal affection that millions of soldiers felt for the simple machine that had carried them through hell and brought them back. The German generals who laughed at the first, captured Jeeps in 1942 were not fools. They were experts in the traditional art of war, and in their experience, weapons were defined by their armor and their firepower. They saw a small, unarmored car and failed to see the revolutionary weapon system that it represented. They saw the object, but they missed the concept. They failed to grasp that the Jeep's true power wasn't in its thin steel plate, but in its sheer overwhelming ubiquity. It was a weapon of relentless, democratized mobility. the central axis of modern industrialized warfare, is not just combat. It is logistics. It is the cold, hard science of moving and sustaining an army. The Jeep was the ultimate logistical tool. It solved the last-mile problem of supply with an efficiency never before seen. It connected the vast industrial engine of the United States directly to the individual soldier crouching in a foxhole. Each Jeep was a node in a vast, interconnected network, and it was the strength and speed of that network that ultimately overwhelmed the Axis war machine. The little car, the one they had dismissed as a toy, was, in fact, a strategic weapon of mass scale. Its impact was measured not in the caliber of its shells, but in its operational tempo, its strategic agility, and its crushing, ever-present numbers. The story of the Jeep is the story of how a seemingly insignificant piece of equipment can change the course of human history. It proves a fundamental truth of modern conflict. Victory is often determined not by the most powerful weapon, but by the most versatile and adaptable one. After the war, the name Jeep itself became the subject of a fierce legal battle, but it was a pointless endeavor. The name had already escaped the confines of corporate ownership and entered the global lexicon as a synonym for freedom and capability. Today, more than 80 years after that first hand-built prototype rattled into Camp Holabird, the brand that began as a weapon of war has sold over 15 million vehicles worldwide, a lasting, rolling legacy of the humble machine that helped win a world war.